The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Riverside County Family Court as Judge Patricia Wells adjusted her reading glasses and glanced at the clock. It was going to be another long day filled with difficult decisions that would change families forever. She had been sitting on the family court bench for 12 years, and while she had seen thousands of cases, each one still weighed heavily on her heart. The courtroom slowly filled with people as the bailiff called the morning session to order. Lawyers shuffled through their papers, family members whispered nervously among themselves, and social workers checked their notes one final time. But it was the small figure sitting in the third row that caught Judge Wells's attention. 8-year-old Kevin sat perfectly still between his grandmother Helen and his caseworker, Mrs. Rodriguez. His small legs dangled from the wooden bench, not quite reaching the floor. He wore a clean blue shirt that was slightly too big for his thin frame, and his dark hair had been carefully combed to the side. What struck the judge most was how quiet he was. Most children his age would be fidgeting, asking questions, or showing some sign of nervousness. But Kevin just sat there staring straight ahead with eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than any child should possess. The case before them was one that Judge Wells had become all too familiar with over the years. A mother struggling with addiction, a child placed in the care of a loving but aging relative, and now, after months of treatment and recovery, a desperate plea to reunite the family. These cases never had easy answers, and they always left someone heartbroken. Lisa, Kevin's mother, sat at the plaintiff's table with her court-appointed lawyer, Mr. Johnson. She was 28 years old, but the years of struggle had left marks. That made her look older. Her hands shook slightly as she smoothed down her modest dress, the same one she had borrowed from her sister for this important day. Every few minutes, she would turn around to look at her son, offering him a small, hopeful smile that he rarely returned. The story began 3 years earlier when Lisa's world had fallen apart. Her husband, Kevin's father, had walked out on them without warning, leaving behind only a note saying he wasn't ready for the responsibility of being a parent. The abandonment had hit Lisa harder than she could have ever imagined. She had always been the type of person who tried to handle everything on her own, but suddenly finding herself as a single mother with no support system had pushed her over the edge. At first, she had managed to keep things together. She worked double shifts at a local diner, trying to pay the rent and buy groceries while also being there for Kevin. But the stress was overwhelming. She barely slept, constantly worried about money, and felt completely alone in the world. That's when she made the mistake that would haunt her for years to come. It started with just a few pills to help her get through the exhausting days. A coworker had offered them, saying they would give her energy and help her focus. Lisa told herself it was temporary, just until she got back on her feet. But addiction doesn't care about good intentions or desperate circumstances. Within months, what had started as occasional use became a daily need, and that daily need soon controlled every aspect of her life. Kevin, who had been a bright and happy 5-year-old, began to notice changes in his mother. She would sleep for long hours during the day, sometimes forgetting to make him lunch or pick him up from school. There were nights when she would pace around their small apartment, talking rapidly about things that didn't make sense to him. He learned to make himself peanut butter sandwiches and to be very quiet when Mommy was having one of her sick days. The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Kevin's kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Peterson, noticed that he had been coming to school in the same clothes for 3 days straight. When she gently asked him about it, he told her that Mommy had been sleeping since Sunday and wouldn't wake up. Alarmed, Mrs. Peterson immediately called Child Protective Services. When the social worker arrived at their apartment, they found Lisa unconscious on the living room floor. Kevin had covered her with his small blanket and had been trying to take care of himself for days. The refrigerator was nearly empty, and the 5-year-old had been surviving on crackers and water. It was a scene that would be burned into the social worker's memory forever. Lisa was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked to save her from what could have been a fatal overdose. Meanwhile, Kevin was placed in emergency care while social services tried to locate any family members who could take him in. That's when Helen, Lisa's mother, stepped forward. Helen was 68 years old and had been living on a modest pension since her husband passed away 2 years earlier. She lived in a small but clean apartment across town, and while she didn't have much money, she had an abundance of love to give her grandson. Despite her age and limited resources, she didn't hesitate for a moment when asked if she would take Kevin in. The transition wasn't easy for either of them. Kevin arrived at his grandmother's house with just a small bag of clothes and a teddy bear that had seen better days. He was confused, scared, and kept asking when his mommy was coming to get him. Helen's heart broke every time she had to explain that mommy was sick and needed time to get better. But Helen was determined to give Kevin the stability he had been missing. She created routines that helped him feel safe. Every morning, she would make him pancakes in the shape of Mickey Mouse. After school, they would sit together at her small kitchen table while he did his homework, and she would help him with the words he didn't understand. At night, she would read him stories until he fell asleep, often staying by his bedside until she was sure he wasn't having nightmares. Slowly, Kevin began to heal. His teacher noticed that he was more focused in class, his grades improved, and he even started making friends with other children. But there was still a sadness in his eyes that Helen recognized all too well. He loved his grandmother dearly, but he missed his mother and couldn't understand why she had gotten so sick that she couldn't take care of him anymore. Meanwhile, Lisa began the long and difficult journey of recovery. After her overdose, she was placed in a residential treatment program where she would spend the next 18 months learning to live without drugs. The program was strict but comprehensive, offering not just medical treatment but also counseling, job training, and parenting classes. For the first time in years, Lisa began to see a glimmer of hope for her future. The road wasn't smooth. There were days when the cravings were so strong that she thought about leaving the program. There were nights when she cried herself to sleep, thinking about all the time she was missing with her son. But she also had moments of clarity where she remembered why she was fighting so hard to get clean. Kevin deserved a mother who could take care of him, protect him, and be the parent he needed her to be. During her time in treatment, Lisa was allowed supervised visits with Kevin. These meetings took place once a month in a sterile conference room at the social services building. A caseworker would sit nearby, taking notes while mother and son awkwardly tried to reconnect. Kevin was always polite during these visits, but Helen noticed that he would be unusually quiet for days afterward. As the months passed, Lisa successfully completed her treatment program. She found a job at a local grocery store, secured a small apartment, and attended weekly counseling sessions to maintain her sobriety. Her caseworker reported that she was doing everything right, following all the requirements set by the court. The time had come to decide whether Kevin should be returned to his mother's care, and that's what brought them all to Judge Wells's courtroom on this particular morning. The judge looked down at the thick file before her, filled with reports from social workers, therapists, teachers, and medical professionals. On paper, it seemed like a success story. A mother who had overcome addiction, a child who was doing well in school, and a family that deserved a chance to be reunited. But as judge, Wells looked at Kevin sitting so quietly in that courtroom. Something nagged at her. In her years on the bench, she had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling her that there was more to this story than what was written in the reports. As the morning progressed, Judge Wells called the court to order and began what everyone expected to be a routine custody hearing. The bailiff, Officer Martinez, had worked in family court for 8 years and had seen hundreds of similar cases. He glanced around the room, noting the usual mix of hope and anxiety that filled these proceedings. Lisa's lawyer, Mr. Johnson, stood up first to present his opening statement. He was a public defender who genuinely cared about his clients, despite being overworked and underpaid. He had spent considerable time preparing for this case because he truly believed that Lisa deserved a second chance. "Your Honor," Mr. Johnson began, his voice steady and confident. "My client has worked incredibly hard to overcome the challenges that led to her son's placement in care. She has successfully completed an 18-month residential treatment program, maintained sobriety for over 2 years, secured stable employment, and found suitable housing. Lisa has done everything the court asked of her and more." Judge Wells nodded, making notes as he spoke. She had read Lisa's file thoroughly and was impressed by the progress documented there. It wasn't often that someone with such a severe addiction managed to turn their life around so completely, Mr. Johnson continued. During this time, my client has never missed a scheduled visitation with her son. She has attended every required counseling session, every court hearing, and has maintained steady employment at Morrison's grocery store for the past 14 months. Her supervisor, Mr. Davis, is here today to testify to her reliability and work ethic. From the gallery, a middle-aged man in a simple suit nodded when his name was mentioned. He had agreed to take time off work to support Lisa because he had seen how hard she was trying to rebuild her life. The state's attorney, Ms. Thompson, sat quietly at her table reviewing her own notes. She was a veteran prosecutor who had handled family cases for over a decade. While she respected the progress Lisa had made, her primary concern was always the best interests of the child. She glanced over at Kevin, who remained perfectly still throughout the proceedings. After Mr. Johnson finished his opening remarks, it was time for the witnesses to testify. The first person called to the stand was Dr. Miller, Lisa's counselor from the treatment facility. He was a soft-spoken man with gray hair and kind eyes who had worked with hundreds of people struggling with addiction over his 20-year career. Dr. Miller, Mr. Johnson asked, can you tell the court about Lisa's progress during her time in your program? Dr. Miller adjusted his glasses and looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, Lisa was one of the most dedicated clients I've worked with. When she first arrived at our facility, she was in a very dark place. She had lost custody of her son, nearly lost her life to an overdose, and felt completely hopeless about her future. He paused, glancing briefly at Lisa before continuing. But something remarkable happened during her treatment. She not only participated in every aspect of the program, but became a mentor to other mothers who were struggling with similar issues. She attended parenting classes even though they weren't mandatory for someone without custody. She volunteered in our community garden and helped organize support groups for other residents. Judge Wells leaned forward slightly, interested in hearing more details about Lisa's transformation. In my professional opinion, Dr. Miller continued, Lisa has not only overcome her addiction, but has developed the tools and support system necessary to maintain her sobriety long-term. She understands the triggers that led to her substance abuse and has developed healthy coping mechanisms to deal with stress and challenges. Mr. Johnson thanked Dr. Miller and called his next witness. Lisa's supervisor from the grocery store, Mr. Davis, took the stand with obvious nervousness. He wasn't comfortable in courtrooms, but he felt strongly that Lisa deserved support. Mr. Davis, the lawyer asked, how long has Lisa been working at your store? 14 months now, Mr. Davis replied, his voice growing more confident as he spoke. She started as a part-time cashier, but we promoted her to full-time within 6 months. She's never been late, never missed a day without calling in advance, and customers often compliment her helpfulness. Would you say she's a reliable employee? Absolutely. In fact, she's one of our best workers. She picks up extra shifts when we need help, and she's training to become a shift supervisor. We're planning to promote her again within the next few months. The testimony continued with Kevin's teacher, Mrs. Anderson, who spoke about his academic progress and behavior in school. She was a veteran educator who had taught second grade for 15 years and had a special fondness for Kevin. Kevin is an exceptional student, she testified. His grades are excellent, and he gets along well with his classmates. However, I have noticed that he seems much older than his years. He's very responsible, almost too responsible for an 8-year-old. Ms. Thompson, the state's attorney, asked, what do you mean by too responsible? Mrs. Anderson chose her words carefully. Kevin often takes care of other children who are upset or hurt. He seems to have a strong need to make sure everyone around him is okay. While these are admirable qualities, they suggest that he may have had to take on adult responsibilities at a very young age. This observation made Judge Wells look more closely at Kevin, who continued to sit quietly with his hands folded in his lap. She had seen this before in children who had experienced trauma or neglect. They often became hypervigilant and overly mature as a way of protecting themselves. Next, the caseworker, Mrs. Rodriguez, testified about her observations during the supervised visits between Lisa and Kevin. She was a dedicated professional who truly cared about the families she worked with, but she also had to be objective in her assessments. The visits have gone well overall, Mrs. Rodriguez testified. Lisa is always prepared with activities for Kevin, and she's clearly learned a lot about child development and appropriate parenting techniques during her time in treatment. Have you observed any concerning behaviors during these visits? Ms. Thompson asked. Mrs. Rodriguez hesitated for a moment. Kevin is always polite and well-behaved during visits, but he seems somewhat reserved with his mother. It's understandable given the circumstances, but there hasn't been the level of excitement or attachment that we typically see when children are preparing to be reunited with their parents. The most emotional testimony came from Helen, Kevin's grandmother. At 71 years old, she had never expected to be raising a young child again, but she had embraced the responsibility with all her heart. As she took the witness stand, her hands trembled slightly and she clutched a tissue. Mr. Johnson asked gently, "Mrs. Patterson, can you tell the court about Kevin's adjustment to living with you?" Helen's voice was soft but strong. "When Kevin first came to live with me, he was like a scared little bird. He hardly spoke for the first 2 weeks, and he would wake up crying almost every night. He kept asking when his mommy was coming to get him, and I had to explain over and over that she was sick and needed time to get better." She paused to compose herself before continuing. "But slowly he started to trust that he was safe with me. He began to smile again, to play with toys, to act more like the little boy he was supposed to be. We developed our routines. I would make him breakfast every morning, help him with his homework, and read him stories at bedtime." "How is Kevin doing now?" the lawyer asked. "He's thriving," Helen said with pride in her voice. "His grades are excellent. He has friends at school, and he's become such a loving, thoughtful child. He helps me with grocery shopping, and he's learned to cook simple meals. Sometimes I forget he's only 8 years old because he's so mature and helpful." Ms. Thompson stood up for cross-examination. "Mrs. Patterson, you're 71 years old. Don't you think Kevin would benefit from being with his younger mother who has now overcome her addiction?" Helen's response was thoughtful and honest. "I won't be around forever, that's true. But right now, Kevin is stable and happy. He's been through so much trauma in his young life, and I worry about what another big change might do to him. I love my daughter dearly, and I'm proud of how hard she's worked to get clean. But my first priority has to be what's best for Kevin." The final witness was Lisa herself. As she walked to the witness stand, her nervousness was obvious to everyone in the courtroom. She had practiced for this moment for months, but being in front of a judge who would decide her family's future was terrifying. Mr. Johnson guided her through her testimony, starting with her addiction and the events that led to losing custody of Kevin. Lisa was honest about her mistakes, speaking openly about the shame and regret she felt. "I know I failed my son," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I was supposed to protect him and take care of him, and instead, I put him in danger. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about what I put him through." "But you've worked hard to change your life," Mr. Johnson prompted. "Yes, I have. Treatment wasn't easy. There were many times I wanted to give up. But every time, I felt like quitting. I thought about Kevin and how much I wanted to be the mother he deserves. I've learned so much about addiction, about parenting, about taking care of myself so I can take care of him." Ms. Thompson's cross-examination was gentle but probing. She asked Lisa about her support system, her plans for child care while she worked, and how she intended to handle the stresses of single parenthood without turning back to drugs. Lisa answered each question thoughtfully, demonstrating the insights she had gained through years of counseling and treatment. She had clearly put a lot of thought into practical matters like after-school care, emergency contacts, and maintaining her sobriety support network. Throughout all the testimony, Kevin remained silent and still. He listened to people talk about his life, his future, and his past, but his expression never changed. Judge Wells found herself watching him more and more as the morning progressed. There was something in his demeanor that troubled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. As the testimony phase of the hearing came to a close, Judge Wells realized that on paper, this looked like a straightforward case. A mother who had done everything required of her, a child who was doing well academically and socially, and a grandmother who had provided excellent care but was aging. The logical decision would be to return Kevin to his mother's care with appropriate support and monitoring. But something deep in the judge's experience told her that she was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. The way Kevin sat so perfectly still, the distant look in his eyes during the supervised visits, and the subtle concern she had heard in some of the testimony all pointed to something that wasn't being said. As she prepared to announce that she would take a brief recess before making her decision, Judge Wells had no idea that the most important testimony of the day was about to come from the most unexpected source. Judge Wells glanced at the clock on the courtroom wall. It was nearly noon, and she felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. She had heard compelling testimony from multiple witnesses, reviewed extensive documentation, and observed the family dynamics throughout the morning. By all accounts, this should be a straightforward case of successful reunification. Lisa had checked every box required by the court system. She had completed treatment, maintained sobriety, found stable employment and housing, and attended every mandated counseling session and visitation. The professionals who worked with her all spoke positively about her transformation and commitment to staying clean. Her progress was genuinely impressive, and Judge Wells had seen far too many cases where parents failed to make even half the effort Lisa had demonstrated. Yet something felt incomplete about the picture being painted in her courtroom. Judge Wells had developed a sixth sense over her years on the bench, and that instinct was telling her there was more to this story. She looked across the courtroom at Kevin, who continued to sit with perfect posture between his grandmother and caseworker, his small hands folded neatly in his lap. Most children Kevin's age would have shown some reaction during the lengthy proceedings. They might fidget, whisper questions to the adults beside them, or show signs of boredom or anxiety. But Kevin had remained perfectly still for hours, his face expressionless, his eyes focused straight ahead. It was the kind of behavior Judge Wells had seen before in children who had learned that being invisible was the safest way to survive. She was about to call for a 15-minute recess when she noticed something change in Kevin's demeanor. For the first time all morning, he had turned his head and was looking directly at her. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and Judge Wells saw something in his gaze that made her pause. It wasn't fear or confusion, but rather a kind of desperate urgency, as if he was trying to communicate something important without words. Helen, Kevin's grandmother, had also noticed the subtle shift in her grandson's behavior. She gently placed her hand on his shoulder and leaned down to whisper, "Are you okay, sweetheart?" But Kevin didn't respond to her question. Instead, he continued to stare at Judge Wells with an intensity that was unusual for a child his age. Mrs. Rodriguez, the caseworker, was reviewing her notes when she became aware of the tension building in the courtroom. She looked up to see Kevin slowly rising from his seat, his movements deliberate and purposeful. This was completely out of character for the quiet, obedient child she had worked with for the past 3 years. "Kevin, honey, sit down," Helen whispered urgently, trying to guide her grandson back to his seat. But Kevin gently pulled away from her grasp, his eyes never leaving Judge Wells's face. The attorneys and other court personnel began to notice the commotion. Mr. Johnson looked confused as he watched his client's son stand up in the middle of what should have been the final phase of the hearing. Ms. Thompson, the state's attorney, leaned forward in her chair, her professional instincts telling her that something significant was about to happen. Lisa turned around from her position at the plaintiff's table, her face filled with concern as she watched her son's unexpected behavior. This was not how she had imagined this crucial day would unfold. She had dreamed about this moment for years, the day she would finally be reunited with Kevin. But now she felt a growing sense of dread as she watched him walk away from his assigned seat. Officer Martinez, the bailiff, instinctively moved closer to Kevin, but Judge Wells held up her hand, signaling him to maintain his distance. Her years of experience had taught her that sometimes the most important moments in a courtroom came from the most unexpected sources. She had a feeling that Kevin had something to say, and she was going to give him the opportunity to say it. The courtroom fell completely silent as Kevin made his way down the aisle between the wooden benches. His footsteps, though small, seemed to echo loudly in the hushed space. Every person in the room, The attorneys, the witnesses, the court reporter, and the few observers in the gallery watched as the 8-year-old boy approached the judge's bench with a determination that seemed far beyond his years. Judge Wells found herself holding her breath as Kevin stopped directly in front of her elevated seat. At barely 4 feet tall, he had to crane his neck to look up at her, but his gaze was steady and unwavering. She could see that his small hands were trembling slightly, but his voice was clear when he finally spoke. "Your Honor," Kevin said, using the formal address he had heard the adults use all morning, "I need to tell you something important." The formality of his language and the seriousness of his tone sent a chill through the courtroom. This was not typical behavior for a child, and everyone present sensed that they were about to hear something significant. Judge Wells leaned forward in her chair, her full attention focused on the small boy before her. "What do you need to tell me, Kevin?" she asked gently, her voice carrying the warmth and patience she reserved for children in her courtroom. Kevin took a deep breath, and Judge Wells could see him gathering his courage for whatever he was about to reveal. His grandmother half rose from her seat, her face etched with worry and confusion. She had raised Kevin for 3 years and thought she knew everything about his thoughts and feelings, but this moment revealed depths to her grandson that she hadn't realized existed. The caseworker, Mrs. Rodriguez, gripped her pen tightly as she prepared to document whatever Kevin was about to say. In her years of working with children in the family court system, she had learned that kids often held crucial information that adults either missed or misunderstood. Sometimes the most important testimony came from the smallest voices. Lisa's lawyer, Mr. Johnson, felt his stomach tighten as he watched his client's case potentially unravel before his eyes. He had worked so hard to present Lisa's remarkable transformation and recovery, and now he sensed that everything might change based on whatever an 8-year-old boy was about to reveal. Ms. Thompson, the state's attorney, sat perfectly still, her years of prosecutorial experience telling her that this was a pivotal moment. She had handled enough family cases to know that children often possessed crucial information about their home situations that adults were unaware of or chose to ignore. Kevin looked around the courtroom one more time, as if making sure he had everyone's attention, then turned back to Judge Wells. The weight of the moment seemed to settle on his small shoulders, and for a brief instant, he looked like the frightened child he truly was, underneath his mature exterior. "I know everyone thinks my mom is better now," Kevin said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And I know Grandma Helen is getting older and maybe can't take care of me forever." Judge Wells nodded encouragingly, sensing that Kevin needed to work up to whatever he really wanted to say. "But there's something nobody knows," Kevin continued, and the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. "Something I haven't told anyone because I didn't know if it was important, but now I think it is." Helen reached out toward her grandson, wanting to comfort him but not daring to interrupt what seemed to be a crucial moment. She could see that Kevin was struggling with whatever burden he had been carrying, and her heart broke to think that he had been keeping secrets during all their quiet evenings together. Kevin's eyes met Judge Wells's one more time, and she could see the weight of whatever knowledge he possessed reflected in his young face. This was a child who had already experienced more trauma and responsibility than most adults, and now he was being forced to make a decision that could change his family's future forever. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes as Kevin stood there, gathering the courage to speak words that would change everything. Judge Wells realized that whatever he was about to say would likely be the most important testimony she heard that day, coming from someone who had the most at stake in her final decision. And then, with a clarity and conviction that stunned everyone in the courtroom, Kevin opened his mouth and spoke the 2 words that would turn Judge Wells's face pale and transform what should have been a routine reunification hearing into something far more complex and troubling. The silence that followed those 2 words was deafening, as every adult in the courtroom tried to process the implications of what they had just heard from the mouth of a child. The 2 words that came from Kevin's mouth hit the courtroom like a physical blow. "She's pregnant." Judge Wells felt her blood run cold as the full implications of those simple words crashed over her. In her 12 years on the family court bench, she had developed an instinctive understanding of when seemingly straightforward cases were about to become complex. and Kevin's revelation had just transformed everything she thought she knew about this family. The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. Every person in the courtroom seemed frozen in place, trying to process what they had just heard and what it might mean. Lisa's face went completely white as she realized what her son had revealed. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably as she gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table, and Mr. Johnson, her lawyer, looked at her with confusion and growing alarm. This was clearly information that had not been shared with him during their preparation for the hearing. Helen slowly sank back into her seat, her hand pressed to her chest. She had spent countless hours with Kevin over the past 3 years, and never once had he mentioned anything about his mother being pregnant. She looked at her grandson with a mixture of pride for his courage and worry about what this revelation might mean. Mrs. Rodriguez, the caseworker, immediately began writing furious notes, knowing that this information would require immediate investigation and follow-up. Pregnancy during recovery was not necessarily a negative development, but the fact that it had been concealed from the court and social services raised serious red flags. Ms. Thompson, the state's attorney, felt her prosecutorial instincts kick into high gear. In her experience, when crucial information was deliberately withheld during custody proceedings, it usually indicated something more serious than simple oversight or embarrassment. But it was Judge Wells who grasped the most troubling implications of Kevin's statement. A hidden pregnancy during a custody battle was concerning enough, but the way Kevin had delivered this information, with such gravity and obvious internal struggle, suggested that there was much more to the story than a simple unplanned pregnancy. "Kevin," Judge Wells said gently, her voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil she felt inside. "How do you know your mother is pregnant?" Kevin looked up at her with those 2 wise eyes that had troubled her all morning. "I heard her talking on the phone," he said simply. She was talking to him about it. "Him?" Judge Wells prompted, though she was beginning to fear she already knew what Kevin was about to reveal. "The man from the treatment place," Kevin replied. "The one who was here today. The one who said nice things about her." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs as everyone turned to look at Dr. Miller, Lisa's former counselor, who had testified earlier about her remarkable progress in recovery. His face had gone pale and he was no longer making eye contact with anyone in the room. Judge Wells called for order and then addressed Kevin again. "Kevin, can you tell me more about what you heard?" The 8-year-old boy took a deep breath, and Judge Wells could see him struggling with whether to continue. This was clearly not easy for him, but he seemed to understand that the truth needed to come out. "Sometimes when I was at Mom's apartment for visits, she would send me to my room to play while she talked on the phone," Kevin explained. "But I could still hear her. She would talk to him about the baby and about keeping it secret until after court. She was scared that if people knew, they wouldn't let her have me back." Mr. Johnson, Lisa's lawyer, looked at his client with a mixture of betrayal and professional concern. "Lisa, is this true?" he whispered urgently. Lisa couldn't meet his eyes or anyone else's. She had buried her face in her hands and was crying softly, the weight of her secret finally exposed in the most public and devastating way possible. Judge Wells felt a familiar sick feeling in her stomach that she always experienced when she realized a case was far more complicated than it initially appeared. "Kevin, did you ever see this man at your mother's apartment?" Kevin nodded solemnly. "Yes, ma'am, he came over sometimes after my visits were supposed to end. Mom would tell Mrs. Rodriguez that I had fallen asleep and needed to stay a little longer, but really he was there." Mrs. Rodriguez looked stricken as she realized that she had been inadvertently facilitating inappropriate contact by allowing extended visitations. As a caseworker, one of her primary responsibilities was ensuring that her clients followed all the rules and requirements set by the court. Judge Wells knew she needed to maintain control of the situation, even though every instinct was telling her to immediately recess the court and launch a full investigation. "Kevin, I need you to be very brave and tell me if this man ever did anything that made you uncomfortable." Kevin's response was quiet but clear. He always acted nice when other people were around, but when it was just him and Mom, he would get angry if she didn't do what he wanted, and he told her that if she didn't keep the baby secret, he would tell people that she was lying about being clean. The full scope of what had been happening became clear to everyone in the courtroom. Dr. Miller had not been providing professional counseling and support to Lisa. He had been manipulating and exploiting a vulnerable woman in recovery, using her desperation to regain custody of her son as leverage to control her. Judge Wells looked directly at Dr. Miller, who was now visibly sweating despite the air-conditioned courtroom. "Dr. Miller, I think you need to speak with your attorney before we proceed any further." She then called for an immediate recess, knowing that the case had just transformed from a routine custody hearing into a criminal investigation that would require the involvement of law enforcement and adult protective services. As the bailiff escorted Dr. Miller from the courtroom, Lisa continued to sob at the plaintiff's table. Her dreams of reunification with her son had been shattered, but more than that, she was facing the realization that she had once again failed to protect herself and, by extension, Kevin from a dangerous situation. Helen stood up and walked over to Kevin, wrapping him in her arms. "You did the right thing, sweetheart," she whispered. "You were so brave to tell the truth." But Judge Wells could see that Kevin was struggling with what he had just done. He had essentially destroyed his mother's chances of regaining custody, and despite his mature understanding of the situation, he was still just a child who loved his mother and wanted his family to be together. During the recess, Judge Wells retreated to her chambers to contact the appropriate authorities. She had handled cases involving professional misconduct before, but the exploitation of vulnerable clients in recovery programs was particularly disturbing because it undermined the entire system designed to help people rebuild their lives. As she sat in her quiet office, Judge Wells reflected on how Kevin's courage to speak two simple words had prevented what could have been a catastrophic situation. If he had remained silent, he would have been returned to his mother's care, where he would have been exposed to ongoing manipulation and potentially dangerous situations. The case that had seemed so clear-cut that morning had revealed the complex layers of deception and exploitation that sometimes lurked beneath seemingly successful recovery stories. And it had taken the wisdom and bravery of an 8-year-old child to expose the truth that all the professional adults had missed. When court reconvened an hour later, Judge Wells knew that her decision about Kevin's custody would be only the beginning of a much larger investigation that would ultimately change how recovery programs monitored relationships between counselors and clients. When Judge Wells returned to the bench after the extended recess, the atmosphere in the courtroom had completely changed. What had begun as a hopeful reunification hearing had transformed into the beginning of a criminal investigation that would eventually make headlines across the state. During the break, several important things had happened. Dr. Miller had been escorted from the building by court security and had immediately contacted a criminal defense attorney. Lisa had been questioned by a detective who had been called to the courthouse, and Mrs. Rodriguez had begun the process of filing reports with multiple state agencies about the misconduct that had apparently been occurring under their supervision. Kevin sat quietly beside his grandmother, but Judge Wells could see the toll the morning had taken on him. Despite his mature decision to speak up, he was still just a child who had been forced to carry the burden of adult secrets and make choices that no 8-year-old should have to make. Helen held Kevin's hand gently, her own emotions a mixture of pride in her grandson's courage and heartbreak over the situation her daughter had found herself in. She had suspected that something wasn't quite right during some of the supervised visits, but she had attributed Lisa's nervousness to the normal stress of trying to rebuild a relationship with her son. Judge Wells began by addressing the immediate custody question, knowing that Kevin needed stability and security while the larger investigation unfolded around him. After careful consideration of all the testimony presented today, and particularly in light of the new information that has come to our attention, I am ordering that Kevin remain in the custody of his grandmother, Helen Patterson, for the foreseeable future. She looked directly at Kevin as she continued. "Kevin, what you did today took incredible courage. You spoke up when you saw something that wasn't right, even though you knew it might hurt people you care about. That's exactly what brave people do. They tell the truth even when it's hard." Kevin nodded solemnly, and Judge Wells could see relief mixed with sadness in his young face. "However," the judge continued, This case is far from over. There will be a thorough investigation into the allegations that have been raised today, and depending on what that investigation reveals, we will need to make new decisions about what's best for Kevin's future. She then addressed Lisa directly. Ms. Chen, it's clear that you've been the victim of professional misconduct and manipulation. While that doesn't excuse the choices you made to conceal important information from this court, I recognize that you were in an extremely vulnerable position and were being exploited by someone who was supposed to be helping you. Lisa looked up at Judge Wells through her tears, grateful that the judge seemed to understand that she had been victimized rather than simply being deceptive. You will continue to have supervised visitation with Kevin while we sort through this situation, but those visits will now be conducted by a different caseworker at a neutral location. I'm also ordering that you receive counseling from a therapist who specializes in helping victims of professional misconduct. Over the following weeks, the investigation into Dr. Miller and the treatment facility where he worked revealed a pattern of abuse that was far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. It turned out that Kevin's revelation had exposed a systematic problem that had affected multiple vulnerable women in the recovery program. Dr. Miller had been exploiting his position of authority to manipulate clients who were desperate to regain custody of their children or rebuild their lives after addiction. He would offer special support and advocacy in exchange for personal relationships, then use the threat of negative reports to control his victims' behavior. The facility where Dr. Miller worked immediately suspended him and launched their own internal investigation. They discovered that there had been previous complaints about his conduct, but these had been dismissed or covered up by administrators who were more concerned about the facility's reputation than the safety of their clients. Kevin's courage in speaking up had not only protected him from a potentially dangerous situation, but had also helped numerous other women who had been too afraid or ashamed to report their experiences with Dr. Miller. The case made national news when Dr. Miller was eventually arrested and charged with multiple counts of professional misconduct and exploitation. The story highlighted the vulnerability of people in recovery programs and led to significant changes in how such facilities monitored relationships between staff and clients. For Kevin, the weeks following the court hearing were difficult, but ultimately healing. In therapy sessions designed specifically for children who had experienced trauma, he was able to process the complex emotions he felt about exposing the truth about his mother's situation. His therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, helped him understand that protecting himself and his mother by telling the truth was not betrayal, but rather an act of love and courage. Kevin gradually came to understand that keeping dangerous secrets was not his responsibility, and that adults should never put children in positions where they have to choose between loyalty and safety. Helen, despite her advanced age, rose to the challenge of providing Kevin with the stability he needed during this turbulent time. The court connected her with additional resources, including financial support and respite care, to help her continue caring for her grandson. Lisa's journey was perhaps the most complex of all. While she was devastated that her reunification with Kevin had been derailed, she slowly began to understand that her son had actually saved both of them from a dangerous situation. With the help of specialized counseling, she began to process the manipulation she had experienced and to rebuild her sense of self-worth. 6 months after the dramatic court hearing, Lisa was doing much better. She had given birth to a daughter, and while the circumstances of the pregnancy were traumatic, she was determined to be a good mother to both her children. Her visits with Kevin had progressed from supervised to unsupervised, and their relationship was slowly healing. Dr. Miller was eventually convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to prison. The treatment facility paid substantial settlements to his victims and implemented comprehensive new policies to prevent similar abuse in the future. Judge Wells often reflected on Kevin's case when she encountered other difficult custody decisions. It had reinforced her belief in trusting her instincts when something didn't feel right about a situation, and it had reminded her that sometimes the most important voices in her courtroom were the smallest ones. A year later, Kevin was thriving. In his grandmother's care, his grades remained excellent. He had developed close friendships at school, and he had even joined the school's chess club, where his strategic thinking and maturity made him a formidable opponent despite his young age. Most importantly, Kevin had learned that his voice mattered and that speaking up about problems was not only acceptable but necessary. He had grown from a quiet, overly responsible child into a more typical 8-year-old who still helped his grandmother, but also knew how to play and laugh like the child he was meant to be. The case had shown everyone involved that true healing and justice sometimes come from the most unexpected sources, and that the courage to speak 2 simple words at the right moment can change not just one family's future, but an entire system that was failing to protect the most vulnerable people it was supposed to serve. Judge Wells kept a photo on her desk of Kevin receiving a Citizens Award from the mayor for his bravery in exposing the treatment facility scandal. It served as a daily reminder that justice often comes from the smallest voices speaking the biggest truths, and that sometimes the most important decisions in a courtroom are made not by judges or lawyers, but by children who have the courage to tell the truth when it matters most.